Back with Rod Nielsen, part two with each one of these pastors that I've asked to engage here. I've given them some kind of topic because I feel like it would be helpful, and especially this way, because when I think about you, I think of you as the eldership guy. And I don't even know that. I think we've done this conference 6 years. I knew of you before that. I don't want to overstate it, but I mean, I think we said hey to each other and kind of stuff at things, but as really knowing you, I didn't. But I remember as I was thinking about trying to put this conference together, and it being more of a leadership conference at that point, I remember somehow hearing that you were going through the book, Biblical Eldership, of which I've never taught through. I've not probably read the whole thing, but I love what's there, the idea. And so there's a sense in which immediately I had a great love for you and respect, and it's grown over the years. So that's what I've asked that we talk about as biblical eldership. So to me, you were quickly seen as the pastor who, very serious. I mean, you're still a very serious guy who sit across the table. I know we're not going to just get off into Looney Tunes area, and I love that. We can talk, we can have fun. Yes. But there's a balance, and there's always a readiness to do that. So on the topic of eldership, and our notes are somewhat different. So on the topic of eldership, what is an elder's task? How would you summarize that?
Well, according to Peter, it's to shepherd the flock over which God has made you overseers. According to Paul, it's to shepherd the flock over which God has made you overseers. Paul said that in Acts 20 when he called to the elders from Ephesus, and he was saying his goodbye. And in fact, he mixes and uses interchangeably all three words for elder: shepherd, presbyter, which is an older guy, and episkopos, which is the bishop, a lot of times translated. Okay, all three of those are the same guys. They're used interchangeably by both Peter and Paul. So the primary task of the elder is to shepherd the flock, the one that God put you in charge of. And then this is one of the things that one can learn from that book, Biblical Eldership, really helps you see what are the elements of shepherding the flock. Well, it's guarding. You know, the elders are responsible to guard the spiritual life of the church, to teach the spiritual life of the church, and to watch over the people of the church. You know, that the elder is not just a guy who makes the decisions for the business of the church. In fact, I have a friend who is involved with an eldership teaching group, and they specifically encourage people, your elder shouldn't even be involved in the budget. You should have other men that you trust who, under the authority of the elders, handle the budget. Now, most small churches can't afford to do that. We don't have enough people to be in that position. But he's got a church of several thousand people, and he's got 4 or 5 really good financial guys in there that can oversee the budget and who are spiritually mature enough to do it on behalf of the church and do it right. So most smaller churches are going to have the elders do that kind of stuff.
So shepherding, and then obviously as you started to delineate all different kinds of things, the protection and the feeding and leading. And
well, for example, at our church, the elders are responsible for everything I preach. So if I mess up, it's their responsibility to correct me and to make sure the church knows I did it wrong. Now, I've never once had to have them do that, thankfully. But if I did, I trust them to come to me and say, Rod, I think you missed this biblical text. You got it wrong. And maybe we need to make sure the church hears it correctly. You know, the closest I came is I had a guy do a skit one time, and he did a great job with it. It was about the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and it talked about his dad and his dad dying when he was young, and people were in tears. He did such a great job. Well, it wasn't a true story. I did not make that clear to the church when I had him do it. And one of the elders did come and say, you know, this isn't a biblical thing, but you need to correct that. And because our people were responding to what I had this man do for me. And that was my responsibility. But it was the elders' responsibility to make sure I get that stuff right. So they're responsible for all the ministry of the church. You know, our children's department works under the authority of the elders. Our worship teams work under the authority of the elders. If our worship teams start doing something that's not consistent with biblical teaching, the elders are the ones that are responsible to fix that, not me, unless I'm an elected elder also.
Words like ruling, governing, 1 Timothy 5:17, let the elders who rule well, just we can go on, but just who rule. Hebrews 13:7, remember those who rule over you. 13:17 of Hebrews, obey those who rule over you. Take up on that if you would.
Well, I don't believe that what that is indicating is that I rule like a king, but I rule like a servant. And what I mean by that is I lead like a servant. And I don't remember exactly what word, the Greek word that's used in either of those, but I know that they're not harsh words. They're not harsh words that indicate that I say what's right and wrong and everything goes my way. Rather, they're words that indicate that I am guiding my people. I'll give you an example. When David was done being king, and then Solomon was king, and then David's other sons started taking over. And I think it was Rehoboam, but it might have been, I forgot his partner's name. Anyway, I think it was Rehoboam that he went to David's advisors, and he said, how should I lead the kingdom? And they said, just love these people. You love and serve them, and they will love and serve you for your whole life. And then he talked to his young buddies. He said, what should I do? And they said, rule with an iron fist and show them who's in charge. Well, he fell apart because he chose the latter. And I think that's the key with eldership. If we're going to use the word rule, and I think it's a fine word to use, or govern, but it's a servant leadership thing it's talking about. And if the elders love on the people of the church and serve them, then the people of the church will love and serve those elders. But if the elders decide that they're just going to be, I'm in charge, we do it my way, you're going to lose people. And we had an example a few years back where we had a particular issue came up. The elders made a decision that some of the folks didn't understand and didn't like it. And some that came to me, we discussed it and we were okay. One couple wrote a letter to our elders, and the elder who received the letter responded on his own without talking to the rest of us. Not only did we lose that couple, we also lost that elder before it was all over. And he's a great guy, and they're great people, the couple. But that he insisted that he was right without just loving people through it. And so that's what an elder's responsibility is.
Yeah, I think about, real quick, an illustration of my own, being together, well, we have in Baptist churches, and I don't necessarily like it as pastor and deacons, but we were in a meeting one time again, and I remember looking at them and saying, if we're not unanimous on this, I don't even begin to want to take it out to the people. If we're not together here, yes. We need that accountability, and especially in a situation like we can cause some damage if we didn't. Exactly.
And I'm not knocking my friend the elder. He's a great guy. I don't know exactly what he wrote to them, but they just informed me that it bothered them. But in our elders meetings, we never vote on anything. When we have an elders meeting, we go around the table and we get consensus. And if we don't have consensus, we table it. And many times there have been situations, including for myself, where I disagreed with the group, but I trust that God was working through the group. And I said, I'll trust you guys. And I've not been disappointed one time because of that.
You and I both come from what's an independent framework. How does that, you and I kind of talked about this, so take off how you see fit. What kind of good things do you see in being independent as opposed to what some other structures are?
Well, I think independent church is more consistent with the New Testament, in that the New Testament, there is no reference to any kind of hierarchy in the New Testament, where there's a denomination where one church is responsible and leads over other churches. The closest you come is that the church in Jerusalem had a greater influence than any other church, Antioch or Ephesus or Corinth. But that was because they had the apostles, not because they had some superiority. And because, for what it's worth, Antioch had Paul. And, I am comfortable that Paul was an apostle. And so they didn't need any other apostles, but they respected the what they called the 12 in Jerusalem. And so they went and talked to them about a theological issue that had come up. Okay, so I think one of the reasons I like the independent is it's consistent with the Bible. But also, with an independent church, nobody tells me or tells us how we have to spend our offerings. We can support whatever missions we choose in our congregation. And I know of some denominational situations where the denomination supports some stuff with their offerings that the people at the local church don't support. And yet they have to send in their dues, and their dues go to something they don't agree with. And so we can avoid that by our independence. And I think that's a good thing. The decisions that are made about our church are made from within our church, by our church. And nobody from outside comes in and tells us how we have to do it. And the people who then are making decisions are people who are living in this and live with the consequences of whatever decisions we make.
Yeah. So on the other end, we've talked about this a little bit. I'm going to put it this way. So what are possible, maybe what do people who are in different structures see as being good that they have that independent churches don't?
For example, I think a church and a denomination they've got someone to turn to when they're struggling. If a small church is getting ready to hire somebody, they might not have anyone that knows how to hire people. And so they might really struggle with that process of getting a good candidate to come in and become the new pastor. Whereas with a denomination, you've got the resources to do background checks and to do the due diligence of getting to know this person, whether he or she would fit in that context or not. And so I think that's valuable. I think if a church gets in trouble financially, a denomination often is able to help them out. But the denomination can also is in a position to make good suggestions to them of what missions they ought to support, things like that. I don't mind that, but it's not necessary. And I think any independent church can do that on its own. If they're having a theological issue, they can just call a big brother up, someone they like. If we were having a problem at our church, I could come down and talk to you and ask you to help us work through it. I could go see Steve Galloway and say, Steve, we're struggling with this theological issue. Would you help us work on this? For example, we handled it on our own, but we had an issue came up over whether or not church leaders should be in the Mason organization. At the time, I thought the Mason organization was the labor union for concrete workers. I didn't know what it was. So we ended up studying it, but had we not been able to find a conclusion, a denomination could call up the headquarters and say, what's the standard answer to this? Or, as we could do it if we wanted to, we could contact another church and said, have you ever worked with this? How would you handle it? And so there's a value to that, but it's also unnecessary because I don't need to have a denomination to do that. I can just make that choice myself.
If you're a friendly pastor and you have some pastor friends,
exactly.
I suppose you could be a lone ranger and be in trouble there. In light of the ruling or governing aspect of the role of an elder, what, if any, are the leadership roles of women in the congregation?
Have you ever heard the phrase, I'm holding a tiger by the tail? Answering that question is like that. I may think I got that tiger under control, but he might turn around and bite me at any time. And letting him go is probably the most dangerous time. Okay, that's it. Personally, I am not comfortable with a woman serving as an elder. Not because there's a specific biblical text that says they can't, but because in the biblical context, there never is a reference to a woman serving as an elder. Now, maybe that's because there wasn't one, so they didn't write about it. Or maybe it's because they didn't allow it, and so they didn't write about it, and they didn't think it was necessary. Whatever, there is no specific biblical reference to a woman serving as an elder. There is a reference to a woman serving as a deacon. Phoebe in Romans 16 is called a diaconus, in masculine word, not in the feminine form. Okay, so I'm comfortable with that kind of role. I have told our church umpteen times whenever this comes up, I'm very grateful for the women in our church who are wonderful leaders who do not press that issue. Because if they did, if some woman came and said, I insist, I think I deserve to be an elder, I would like to be nominated for elder, our leaders would study it, and whatever we concluded would create division. If we concluded that it's okay, it would create division. If we concluded that no, a woman cannot serve as an elder biblically, it would create confusion. And so I thank our women and I praise them for not making us go through that. If they did, we would study it. Probably my conclusion, and I've studied this a lot, my conclusion would be that no, women should not serve as an elder. I had one couple visited our church, and I was talking about it that particular Sunday, and I heard from someone else that they said they're never coming back because Rod hates women in church leadership. Well, no. We've got several women that are very good leaders that are leading areas of ministry in our church. But whatever they do is done under the auspices of the elders and under the authority of the elders. And the elders are doing it under the authority of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, sure. I hate to hand you the tail of a tiger like that, but I appreciate that. In closing, what I think I have somewhat found, and I've given you a copy of this thing. This is a paragraph from the book. I didn't write down what page it is. But I found it interesting because what I find sometimes is, you go to the average person on the street and say, what's a minister? Well, they would immediately associate that with a pastor, I think, at least what I run into. And I think that's troublesome because I don't think that's a proper understanding of it, because we're all ministers. And this, so let me just read this paragraph here, because I think it's helpful and leads to that. And before I do that, again, connecting that back with what I think some people, or part of the confusion is with women ministering in the church, okay? We must balance what we have been saying about the elders' ministry with the parallel truth of every member ministry. Although the elders lead and are officially responsible for the oversight of the whole church, they are not the total ministry of the church. They are not the ministers. Ministry is the work of the whole church. Ministry is not the work of one person or even one group of people. So if I'm hearing that right, and I think biblically that is right, we could talk about men ministers, women ministers, all of us in the church being ministers.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes or do you think sometimes that that's where part of the confusion is, to act like they, just using the wrong words maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think to a certain extent it's semantics. What's the difference in our culture? What's the difference between a minister and a pastor? There isn't one. If somebody asks me what I do for a living, I tell them, well, I'm a minister, or a lot of times I say I'm a preaching minister at Agape Christian Church. But if I say I'm a minister, or if I say I'm a pastor, they get the same idea. But this is where the church is responsible to communicate that the ministry is all of ours. It's the whole church. Everyone is responsible to be involved in the ministry of the church. And so our responsibility as leaders is to guide people in finding where God has gifted them and where they have the talents and the heart for, and get them involved. Whether it's a man or a woman. We have some wonderful women in our church. We have men in our church who couldn't lead a Bible study to save their lives. But if you have some physical project that needs to be done, they're the first guys there, and they get it done. Whatever it takes, they get it done. That's ministry. We had a woman in the church recently. Her water heater was totally gone, and she had no hot water. I got two guys, went and bought a water heater, took it over and put it in for her. Okay. Now there was no biblical context there, but that was ministry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I agree with Strauch on what that quote that you read. We have to communicate, even as we talk about the elders being responsible for it. we have to communicate that, but they're not alone in responsibility. They're the ones at this point appointed to lead, but all of us are responsible for the ministry. In fact, my role is actually to serve the elders in the church in guiding the ministry. And they trust me to carry that through well. They trust me to teach the word correctly and to teach it well. And so we get along pretty well with that.
Makes me think of Ephesians 4, starting with 11 or 12
Yes.
there, where you have those who are in places of leadership, teaching leadership, so that the whole church grows and
Right, yeah.
it's about the ministry.
The Holy Spirit appointed some to be apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers to build the whole church body up until we all come to the fullness of Christ. That's it. That's well said.
Every minister doing their part. Yeah, so I kind of got off a little bit, but we can end now. But is there any things on the sheet that that you're going, man, I wish we could
One of the
talk
questions
about
you had asked me is there anything else that I see might be a helpful subject? And I have these thoughts here. I believe that whatever we do in the church should be led by and supported by the Bible. The difference between those two verbs is that our worship, our church structure, our purpose are directed by the Bible. We don't just think it up and this is how we're going to do it. This is what the Bible tells us we can and should do. Now, the Bible's not specific on everything. God has left us to use our freedom and our creativity for many things. And so where the Bible is not specific and clear and direct, it is our biblical foundation that gives us a base to make the decisions about how we do church and how things are going to work. We do our best to do what the Bible does teach. You perhaps have heard the phrase before, we speak where the Bible speaks, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. We try to be that way. If the Bible talks specifically about an issue, we teach it. If it doesn't talk specifically about an issue, we may talk about it, but we don't say this is the Word of God. And I'm very careful in my sermons when I'm preaching, and I'll say this is what the text says, and I have people see it. I project it on the screen, and I ask them to read it in their Bibles, and I help them interpret it and help them translate it so they understand it. And I tell them, this is from God. This isn't from me. And then when I have things that they're my thoughts, and I think they're biblically based and they're spiritually founded, but I make it clear that this is my thought, and you may take it or leave it. If you trust me, trust me. If you don't trust me, or if you think I missed it, then don't worry about it. And so I would encourage churches to let the Bible lead the way. Don't go, well, this is the way our church does it. Why? You know, why does your church do it? If there's a good reason for it, then do it. You know, perhaps you've heard the story of the woman who, a little girl, her mom was cooking a roast, and she cut it in half, put it in 2 pans to put it in the oven. And the little girl said, "Why did we do that?" Said, "Well, it's called Grandma did it." "Let's call Grandma." And they called Grandma, and she said, "Why do you do it that way?" She said, "Well, that's how my mom did it." So they called Great Grandma. She said, "Why do you do that?" She said, "I didn't have a big enough pan." Okay, there wasn't a reason for it that everyone needed to follow. But at that time it worked because they didn't have enough pan. Well, now we got a big enough pan, so you don't have to do it that way. And so we have to be careful in our churches that we don't let our church decisions, our church traditions and stuff overstep the Bible. And I think we have to be very careful about that. Because I do believe that too much of the church in America are doing their own thing without regard for the word of truth. And so I think it creates problems in the long run. Now, I don't care, Tim, every church can do it differently than I do, but have a biblical reason for why they do. We went through the conflict, and not too distant past, of do we sing the old hymns or the new contemporary worship songs? Well, the old hymns are no different, no better than the contemporary ones. I think a lot of the contemporary ones are really well-written stuff, and they're hymns too. There's, you know, the Bible talks about psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Okay, a psalm is exactly that. It's the word of God put to music. A hymn is a song written about the Bible, or written about spiritual things, Bible things. A spiritual song is a song that was led by the Holy Spirit to write. That's the only difference. Just like spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts aren't just my natural talents. These are things the Holy Spirit was involved in. And so we went through that, but our decision wasn't based on this is what I like, or this is how we've always done it.
Or this is fun. This will be fun.
Yeah. This was based on what will reach people to help them grow in Christ as they sing the song. Every song we sing at church, before we sing it, I talk about why we're singing it. You know, we sing sometimes. You know the song "I Am Who You Say I Am"? You familiar with that?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, it's a fairly new worship song, and the singer is saying, "I am who Jesus tells me I am." Okay, and so before we sing that song, I talk about that, and because I don't want people singing the song just for the sake of singing it. Mm-hmm. Sing that song because it teaches me about God, or it helps me say something to God. You know, there's a lot of are you familiar with the song "Draw Me Close to You"? Are you familiar with the song "Open the Eyes of My Heart"?
Yep.
Okay, I never prayed that prayer until I sang that song one time. Not that it wasn't a good thing, and I probably thought along those lines, but one time somebody introduced me to that song, and I thought about it, and I thought, that's a cool thing to ask God to do, to open the eyes of my heart so that I see Him more clearly. And so now when I sing that song, I'm praying. I'm not just singing. Okay, and so what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to make a decision on the kind of music we use and the specific songs we use based on what is consistent with biblical truth, and then use that to guide me in my spiritual life.
Good stuff. Well, let's call it an end there. And let me put a little plug in, because as you're talking, Steve Galloway, the topic with him is principles of worship. Normative, regulative, liberal, all those kind of things. And so good stuff.
Yeah, I'll look forward to hearing his speech on that, or podcast on that. Steve's a good guy. He teaches good stuff.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
You know, in the years that we've been together, I've been impressed that all three of us are committed to teaching good stuff. And I think that's what makes our conference work.
Absolutely. Thank you, my friend.
All right. God bless.